So, Hare Krishna. So you can all hear me all right?
Yeah.
So, we're going to speak about the Ten Commandments, is that right?
Yes, Raj.
Okay, why not? Let's see, very good. The Ten Commandments are actually, of course, given twice in the Old Testament, in two different places, and there are other lists of commandments. So, okay, I'll speak a little bit about it. First of all, we'll just talk about the Ten Commandments as far as what they really are. And according to scholars, the structure of the commandments actually matches the normal structure for an ancient Middle Eastern contract. In the sense that in a contract, like even today in a legal contract, the first thing is that you introduce who the different parties are, who the people are that are somehow taking part in this contract. And so in the first commandment is that God, who is, that God, who is presenting the contract, he first identifies himself. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of bondage. So the first statement of the Ten Commandments identifies who is actually establishing this agreement, this covenant. And of course, the word covenant just means a contract. It's like a type of legal agreement. And if you know ancient Jewish history, for example, at the time of Jesus, the people that Jesus mostly debated with were called the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are sort of the proto-rabbinic Judaism tradition, the Talmud tradition, in the sense that there's a type of, I don't want to say legal relationship with God, but there are rules. There are rules and there are laws, and that you establish a good relationship with the boss. You establish a good relationship with the ultimate authority by following the rules. And of course, you have this in India. There's a direct parallel in India in what is called the Smarta tradition. They are very much Pharisees. They're just like that. And actually, Lord Chaitanya sometimes is like Jesus, and the Smartas are like the Pharisees. But the word smart in Sanskrit comes from the Sanskrit word smriti, which means to remember or memory, smriti. But in this context, it's a category, it's a genre of sacred literature. So you have what is called Shruti literature, these sacred texts called Shruti, which are held to be texts which are spoken by great sages who were enlightened, who in that sense had direct access to a higher truth coming from God, and they speak the truth that they see, and then we hear it. So our position is we hear this truth that is coming from enlightened beings. And therefore, this class of literature, this oldest class of literature, like, for example, the Vedas, is called Shruti, in the sense that we simply hear it. But the Vedas, as it is said in the Brahma Samhita, one of our important books, Vedeshu Durlabham, it's hard to actually find God in the Vedas because it's somewhat esoteric literature. There are all kinds of parts of the literature which are not directly about God. And so therefore, there's a need for, you could say, explanation. There's a need for explanation. And so that explanatory literature is called Smriti because we remember, in a sense. It's one remembers the knowledge that was given and then explains it further. So there are these two basic categories of literature, Shruti and Smriti. Now, in the Smriti category, there are some literatures which are, you could say, transcend their own category, like the Bhagavatam, which becomes ultimately the highest spiritual authority. But there's another class of Smriti literature which does not transcend its category, doesn't transcend its genre. And that's the literature which is typically called the smarta literature, in the sense that it's very much a lower category, and specifically here, the smarta literature which concerns us is what is called the Dharma Shastras. The word Dharma in Sanskrit can mean many things, and but it also is the word for law. So the law books, the books of rules and laws are called Dharma Shastras, and people who very strictly follow all these rules and laws, they're called smartas or smarta Brahmins. And hence, if you know anything, 1 second, I just have to say something in German. So the Pharisees were people who took the laws as very important, or actually it's as the central process for pleasing God, getting the grace of God, and getting whatever benefits or reward you can get by pleasing God. So similarly, you have the smarta people who also believe that you just have to follow these rules. So the Ten Commandments, the first commandment establishes who's talking, who's the authority here. And I am the Lord your God. And then the second commandment it defines what the proper relationship is with that God. That I am the Lord your God that brought you out of Egypt. In other words, I'm the one who saved you. And I'm the one who can save you again. So don't worship someone else, because I'm the person that's actually protecting you. So again, this is first defining I am the Lord your God, and then saying that you shall have no other gods before me. I brought you out of Egypt, and then the second commandment, actually, you shall have no other gods before me. Now, one interesting point about this is, as scholars understand, and the information I'm presenting you is basically mainstream scholarship. This is, nowadays there's all kinds of like weird websites and conspiracy theories and weird things, but what I'm giving you is very much just basic scholarship that you would get at any good university, either in your country or America or any other country. And so the Old Testament admits that there are other gods. The second commandment does not say there are no other gods, which is what you would find, for example, from a much later figure like Paul, the St. Paul of the New Testament, who didn't understand the Old Testament that well. But anyway, so Paul says that there are no other gods. I mean, there are many problems with Paul, but that's another topic. So Paul says, but the Old Testament doesn't deny these gods. In many places, the Old Testament admits there are other gods. It's just that they're not the God for you. You have to worship me. You have to worship the supreme God, not these other gods, but they exist. That's the significant point of the second commandment. In fact, if you look at the Old Testament, where the great King Solomon, who built the first temple in Jerusalem, he had many wives, he was polygamous, and he had a non-Jewish wife. And this non-Jewish wife was a pagan. She didn't worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She had her demigods. And so what did Solomon do? Did he kill her or reject her? No, he actually built her a little mandir. He built her a little shrine, a little temple, so she could worship her gods. Not only that, but he built it on the Temple Mount. If you know where the first and second temples were built, they're on this high land in the city of Jerusalem, the city that was built by Solomon's father, David. And so he chose this plateau, this high piece of land to build the temple. And so that's called the Temple Mount. So right on that Temple Mount, he built her a little shrine, a little mandir, so she could worship her God. So that was quite, you could say, liberal and sort of open-minded. So So this idea that no other gods exist, that there's only the one God. One thing I want to make clear here is that obviously what the Bible is teaching is monotheism, that there's one God. However, there are two kinds of monotheism. There is what I call tribal monotheism, and there is philosophical monotheism. Tribal monotheism means that you believe there's only one supreme God, but you and your friends are the only ones who are worshiping that God. And if someone else in some part of the world, or maybe your neighbor, worships, oh, let's say they believe they're worshiping God, they think they're worshiping God, but they use some other name, then that person is really making a big mistake and is very likely going to hell. So this is tribal monotheism, where you identify with your tribe and everyone else is the other, the outsider, and God belongs, there's one God, but that one God belongs to your tribe. This kind of tribal monotheism has caused a lot of trouble in the world. I mean, a lot of wars. If you look at, I mean, there's this common idea that religion has caused so many wars, I'm sure, in, Holland they say the same thing. The Nederland. But actually, if you look at the history of religion, the wars have been caused not by religion, but by tribal monotheisms. For example, look at the Greeks and Romans. I mean, the Romans were very militaristic. They practically never met a war they didn't like. And so the Romans were very militaristic, and yet the Romans never fought a war to bring Jupiter to other people. It wasn't about bringing Jupiter. It was about getting money and power. By the way, the word Jupiter is Sanskrit. You may be interested to know. You know the word Jupiter, right? As in the planet. Dew in Sanskrit means heaven, and Peter means father. So Jupiter means the father of heaven. It's actually a Sanskrit word that came into Latin. So there's another kind of monotheism, which is philosophical monotheism. That is, you come to a philosophical understanding, which philosophers almost inevitably do, that there is one God. I mean, an example is Plato. Plato is often considered the greatest Western philosopher, and so Plato also reasoned his way to a type of monotheism. Because if you think of what philosophy is, or even what science is, it's trying to find the most explanatory categories. For example, let's say you see a horse. Somewhere in Holland, there's actually still a horse that has survived modernization. And so let's say that you see a horse, and maybe it's the first horse you ever seen. So, oh my God, there's some animal with 4 legs and a tail and a big neck. And so it's just a single experience of a horse. But then, let's say you see another one, and you recognize it looks like the same kind of animal. And then you see a third one. And so what happens is, and the Greeks talked a lot about this, the Greek philosophers, that you develop the category of horse. Not just that I saw some big animal with a long neck and 4 legs, but there is a category of horse. And then maybe you study other animals and you realize there's even a bigger category, which is mammals. Or you could say quadruped, 4-legged animals, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, so as you develop larger and larger categories or subcategories, it's this process of categorization that ultimately constitutes science. Or, for example, let's say you, like in biology, you could say, because from the Greek bios in Greek means life. And of course, logos is like logic or the explanation. So bios, logos, the biology is just the logical explanation of life. And so ultimately we have this very large category, which is life itself, which includes reptiles and mammals and even members of the Hare Krishna movement. So Anyway, so then you have this very large category. But again, we're talking about science or philosophy as the power to see connections, relationships, categories. How do they relate to each other? And so therefore, if you look at the history of philosophy, polytheism is not philosophically satisfying. In fact, if you look at polytheism, you could say that polytheism is pre-philosophical. In fact, scholars have studied, for example, if you look at the different forms of polytheism that were popular in the ancient Near East, where Judaism arose, you could say Judaism arose over and against polytheism. And in all these Near Eastern, Middle Eastern polytheisms, the gods were not the supreme power. Because even the polytheists realize that if you just have a bunch of gods and goddesses, it's a mess. And it may explain who you have to satisfy in order to, for the rain to come down or to be protected from your enemies, but it doesn't philosophically explain anything. And so even in polytheistic communities, they tend to see all these gods as coming from some higher power, which they don't really understand very well. So ultimately, when one tries to be rational and philosophical, you have to face you could say the intellectual or the philosophical need for a truth, a single truth that explains all other truth. So that's basically and that's how Plato came to, logically to the need for some type of monotheism. But again, there's tribal monotheism, but then there is philosophical monotheism. And if you look at the Greco-Roman civilization, the classical civilization, what we find is that it tended to favor philosophical monotheism and therefore to be inclusive and eclectic. For example, some quick examples, and we'll go back to the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not fail to give donations to sannyasis. That's the 11th commandment. Anyway, so, for example, Alexander the Great is a very interesting character. He had this one world project. When Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, which is basically what he did, he conquered the Persian Empire and then a little bit of West India. He wanted to unite the world. He actually wanted to create this world civilization, and he was willing to compromise. He thought it should actually be a balance between East and West. Alexander did not want to impose Western culture on the East. He wanted to also, that's why, for example, he married an Eastern girl, and he insisted that all of his generals marry Eastern girls because he wanted to bring these two civilizations together. And the Romans were very eclectic. The Romans understood, they were the great organizers, and the Romans understood that religious fanaticism will make it impossible to have a world civilization, and therefore the Romans saw whatever divine power they were worshiping, they saw it in other religions. So, for example, the Roman emperor used to give donations to have worship done in Jerusalem in the name of the emperor. It's just like we know the Hindu community, they pay money and you do a puja for them for this or that. So the Romans would actually support all these different religions because they were all just different manifestations of divine power. So you find that kind of philosophical monotheism in civilizations that have developed systematic philosophy, and you tend not to find it in civilizations that do not have serious, let's say, developed systematic philosophical traditions, like ancient Israel. If you look at ancient Israel, which is not only, of course, the Old Testament, but the civilization from which Christianity came, what you find is there's certainly wisdom, and there's poetry, and there's devotion, but not systematic philosophy. There's no systematic, and by systematic philosophy, I mean the great categories of rational thought, such as epistemology. Basically, how do you know you know? You know, what is the nature of knowledge? Under what conditions are you justified to say that you have knowledge and not just an opinion or a belief? So what is real knowledge? Or, for example, ontology or metaphysics. What is the nature of existence? What are the fundamental categories of real things? Or political philosophy. Or ethics. For example, what is right and wrong? If you say, for example, in English, any English sentence that has the word should or must is an ethical claim. For example, you should do this. You must not do that. And so how can you rationally justify telling people what they should and should not do? That's ethical philosophy. So in terms of having a tradition which systematically, categorically explains all these things, they didn't have a tradition like that in ancient Palestine. But they did in Greece and Rome. And so, and in India they had it also. So again, in places in the world where they had systematic philosophy, they tended to develop different forms of philosophical monotheism, and they were not fanatical in general. Both in India and in the classical world of Greece and Rome and everywhere in between, they tended to be not fanatical, to be inclusive, eclectic. So let's go back to the Ten Commandments and see where the Ten Commandments stand in that picture. So, do you all follow so far? Give me some water. Okay. So the commandment, I am the Lord your God, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, and you shall have no other gods before me. So this does not deny there are other gods. It just says, hey, I'm your God. Now, that in itself is not fanatical. Because if the person saying that is the supreme God, thank you, and talking about demigods, then it's not a fanatical claim. Because if you put a demigod or a nature god before the supreme God, you're just not understanding the nature of reality. So, because even in Holland and America and every country in the world, there's a system of government, and you have to know the hierarchy, how it works. So, for example, a regional authority, the mayor of a city, or I don't know what you call it in Holland. Do you have states or regions? I don't even know what you have there. I'm a typical ignorant American. What do you have in Holland? Do you have states or counties or? Huh? Province. Okay, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with provinces. So, there are leaders in the province, but the leader of a province cannot make a law which violates a national law. And so, if let's say you have in your Dutch constitution or whatever you have, if it says that a provincial authority cannot make a law that violates a national law, that's not fanaticism. It's just getting things right, understanding the hierarchy of authority. And so in the same way, to say that you should worship me and not other gods is not necessarily fanaticism. It may just be a normal affirmation of a hierarchy of authority. So that's one point. Now, third commandment, do not make graven images. Don't make deities, or actually graven means like a stone image. From the Sanskrit word gravan, which means stone, graven. So What about that? Like